Hi, this is Jen Rubin, editor-in-chief of The Contrarian. I have with me today Stephen Cook from the Council on Foreign Relations to talk Middle East, foreign policy, and all things national security. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks for having me back, Jen.
The Prime Minister of Israel and the President of the United States met yesterday, and they laid out a 20-point plan for Gaza. Um, Apparently, the two of them agree. What was
Right.
in the plan? Let's start there.
Well, it's 20 points. It actually was 21 points, but Netanyahu negotiated out one of the points. So now it's a 20-point plan. And basically what it does is it calls for the end of the conflict in Gaza. Hamas is to hand over all of the hostages at once. Israel is to release 1,700 prisoners plus 250 that were serving life sentences in Israeli prisons. And the IDF would withdraw in stages as Hamas disarms. In the place where the IDF was will be this international security force made up of, we're not really sure, countries from where, maybe the Arab world, maybe from the broader Muslim world, perhaps Europeans, who knows. Then there would be this board of peace that would be shockingly led by President Trump. And but former Prime Minister of the UK, Tony Blair, would be deputized essentially to run the Gaza Strip under this board of neutral individuals who would help rehabilitate the Gaza Strip, along with technocratic Palestinians who would stand up governance there. Um, this is an agreement that quite clearly favors the Israelis. And it's essentially asking Hamas not to be Hamas any longer. And although they have been badly beaten on the battlefield, Hamas wants to suck the Israelis into the fight that it's having so it can continue to broadcast these horrifying images from Gaza, continue to delegitimize Israel in the international community, and the Israelis can right wing will continue to say the only solution here is occupation and annexation of the Gaza Strip, all of which is a total nightmare, but a win for Hamas at this point. So Hamas, the current is the president is giving Hamas 3 or 4 days to respond.
So let's start with some basics. Who's going to pay for all of this?
Well, I think the presumption is that the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris, and others would open their checkbooks and write big checks. They have maintained from the very beginning, and they're all supportive of this plan. I think the Arab states and Indonesia and Pakistan and Turkey have come to the conclusion that this is really the only way to bring this to an end, and it is causing them so much trouble at home because their citizens are not seeing them do anything to oppose Israel, that just cutting this deal and bringing this to an end would be the best thing. But in any event, the major Arab countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar have opposed writing the check for the reconstruction of Gaza unless there was some horizon for an end to the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, an actual end. There's nothing in this agreement that provides a horizon for Palestinians or Israelis for bringing this conflict to an end. There's a supposition that once you bring it to an end, that the United States and the chairman of the Board of Peace would continue working at that. But of course, we know that the president loses interest in issues if he doesn't get results very, very quickly. And this is obviously not something that will get resolved very quickly, if at all.
If the Arab states are no longer insisting upon that end goal, have they given up on a two-state solution? Have they kind of thrown in the towel, or are they just willing to kick the can down the road? So what will be in the future.
I don't think that they've given up on the two-state solution. At least they'll continue to mouth, particularly the Saudis, a serious time-limited process that leads to a Palestinian state. But I think, as I said, the Arab leaders just want this to be over. It is causing them trouble, not in the sense that you have a divided society and some people are supporting the Israelis and some people are supporting the Palestinians. No, they are in fact outraged that their governments haven't done more to oppose Israel.
Now, this deal theoretically could have been reached a year ago, or maybe even sooner. Why would it work now when it hasn't worked in the past?
Yeah, I mean, that is the tragedy of all of this, is that a year ago this could have happened. I think that there have been, I think three major problems here. Obviously, Hamas has not evinced a tremendous amount of interest in a ceasefire that forces them to give up the hostages, which is their only leverage and their only shield against the total annihilation at the hands of the IDF. Believe it or not, the IDF believes it has not fought with its full force, with actually a hand behind their back, because they have been worried about the well-being of Israeli hostages. And of course, Prime Minister Netanyahu has never been really interested in a ceasefire, because his coalition is dependent upon not having a ceasefire, even though 70, 75, 80, now 85% of the Israeli public supports a ceasefire. The way in which Israel's electoral laws are written, these fringe parties, which are now part of the government and their people are ministers, can have a lot of power over the government. And then, of course, a year ago, neither the United States nor the Arab countries were able to or willing to put the kind of pressure they seem to be willing to put pressure on Hamas and Israel. I mean, one of the other things that I should add is, the strike on Hamas. That was a violation of Qatari sovereignty. The countries were very angry. Their neighbors were very angry. The Saudis were wondering, are they going to get bombed if they host a delegation of Houthis who are also at war with Israel? But you get the sense that this also scared the Qataris, that the war was coming home to them, and that they're more willing to put the screws to Hamas to agree than before. You hate to kind of give that win to what was, I think, a foolhardy decision on the part of Netanyahu that the Mossad and the IDF opposed, but there was this unintended consequence that the Qataris seem to have gotten, pardon the pun, religion on this.
Interestingly, Trump made him apologize in public, which must have been hard for him to swallow.
Right.
Now, in the past, Bibi has always said, well, even if I wanted to do this, I can't possibly hold my government together because none of these people will go along. How does he get past that problem? And are the other parties who are in the opposition willing to support and, frankly, keep him in power in order to
Right.
get this resolution?
Right. I mean, this is the big challenge. I mean, this is a new plan. There are positive aspects to it. Of course, there are very not positive aspects to it. But Netanyahu has to sell it to the security cabinet. And that's not an easy task. If you notice, if anybody who either read the transcript or watched the Netanyahu's appearance with Trump yesterday, he started out by saying this agreement absolutely is consistent with Israel's strategic objectives in this conflict. He was clearly speaking to the right wing in Israel, who will be determinant here. However, if they bolt from the government, the opposition parties have said that they will support the government in order to get this deal. Now,
Right.
they've said that before. Netanyahu hasn't been willing to do it because it would mean his government would fall after a deal. Well, the Israeli government is going to fall anyway, either right after the Knesset, Israel's parliament, comes back in a few weeks, or in March, or it will serve out its term within a year, which very few Israeli governments actually do. So it may be worth it to him to do this, get the support from the outside parties, get the win, because 85% of the Israeli public supports ending the war, and then go to elections. That would be rational, but there's often things that within the within the bounds of Israeli politics don't work out that way.
Now, also something that has changed obviously in the last year is Israel has really changed the entire power equation in the Middle East by what they did with Hezbollah in Lebanon, by their action against Iran itself. So the so-called ring of fire that they were faced on all fronts with hostile, mostly Iran-backed forces has greatly been diminished. How much did that play into their potential willingness to make a deal like this?
Well, yes and no, but it's been hard for the Israelis, and pardon the phrase, it's become like a bad thing to say this in Washington. It's been hard for the Israelis to take the win.
Yeah,
They have greatly weakened Hezbollah. The greatly weakening of Hezbollah meant that Hezbollah could not muster the forces to defend Bashar al-Assad in December 2024.
right,
That led to the fall of Assad. This collapsed Iran's entire Western front. And then, of course, you had the so-called 12-day war, which also greatly weakened the Iranians. The Israelis are in a much better strategic position than they were on the eve of the October 7th attacks. Yes, they still confront missile fire and drone fire from the Houthis, but at least test that. The Houthis say they'll stop firing if there's a ceasefire in Gaza. Test it. And then people in Israel can sleep a night without having to worry about Houthi missile strikes.
right.
But Israeli politics have not allowed them to do this because there has been this political imperative to totally destroy Hamas. And that
Right.
has meant continuing operations in Gaza.
Let's say, for sake of argument, that the deal is made. There are many things that could knock this off track. It could be that the hostages are all dead, and that horrible realization may infuriate and create an uproar on Israel's part, so they don't want to go forward. It may be that although Hezbollah as an entity agrees to this deal, that there are pockets of other people, and they keep shooting at the Israeli forces and they keep shooting at Israeli civilians. And then, of course, there's the problem about who actually does the work. What we have had is a strange situation in Gaza that many people may not realize, where you have essentially Hamas technocrats who are on the payroll of the PA, the Palestinian Authority. So do they continue even though they're technically Hamas? How do you get the roads cleared and the buildings rebuilt
Right.
and all the rest of it?
Well, I mean, these are all great questions, Jen. And I think one of them I just want to pick apart before I get to your last one is the problem of who's going to agree to this. Already, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which is sometimes competitive, sometimes cooperative with Hamas, has rejected it out of hand and said it is a formula for igniting the entire region. Then, of course, you have this problem of atomized Hamas brigades who go off on their own, and then other groups, armed groups, criminal gangs, and so on and so forth. So that's a problem this international stabilization force is going to have to confront. And are Egyptian forces really going to get in between there? What will happen the first time an Egyptian soldier gets shot? What happens? Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney was asked about this during the UNGA. He said, well, what's the plan for disarming Hamas? He basically said, I'm for it, but there isn't really a plan here. So that's a real pitfall. I mean, you can go back to the Oslo process, which had all these detailed plans that were derailed by extremists and,
Right.
so hopeful in September 1993. By January 2000, you had the second Intifada. So it's a September 2000, you had the second Intifada. On this last question, who is going to do this? Well, hopefully, if we get to that point, people will have learned their lessons from Iraq, for example, and recognize that Palestinian technocrats who've been caught in Gaza may or may not be Hamas, but nevertheless, they're technocrats. They know how to get things done. So even if they are Hamas affiliated, and it's hard not to be over all of these years that Hamas has controlled the Gaza Strip, that everybody should hold their nose and understand that there are people who know, where the papers are, where the keys are, how to unlock this, how to do that, and that there will be this technocratic, as apolitical as possible group of Palestinians that are working hand in hand with Tony Blair and whatever it is that he comes up with. But I mean, just the optics of this with Tony Blair are too bizarre to me. I mean, he's the new British proconsul in Gaza. I mean, the
Right.
historical echoes here are almost too much for me to deal with. It's just so. Well, one wants to be hopeful about it. Again, you are pointing out all the wrinkles and crinkles and details here that can derail this thing. And we have seen this happen over and over and over again every time the president announces we're close to some sort of deal.
So let me pull back to a larger issue. the United States wrestles every year with something called the National Security Plan, National Security Directive. And it basically says who are our enemies, what the game plan is, what our priorities. And before today's bizarre meeting, which I will get to in a moment, there was a relatively substantial leak to the Washington Post that said a lot of the generals, and in fact, the highest levels of our military don't agree with this idea that we should be pulling back from Europe, we should be pulling back from places around the world. And how do you actually engage China if you do pull back from the Far East? Talk to us a little bit about what's going on and how serious is this gap between what inexperienced, frankly, crackpot civilian leaders want to do and what experienced military people understand is in the national security interest of the United States.
Yeah, well, the national security strategy of the United States, you could easily dismiss it and say, this is something you can put up on the shelf. I mean, I guess people don't do that anymore. Delete, read it, and then delete it. But in fact, what it maps out is how the United States is going to direct its resources for the purposes
Yes.
of national defense and national security. And so, what is clearly the case, I mean, this group of people, the president, the vice president, want to pull back from Europe. That seems odd. You can say the Europeans need to step up and meet their commitment to in NATO to spend 5% of their GDP or 2% of their GDP on defense, but to pull out, especially now with a war, 3 years of war, almost 4 years of war in Europe, that seems completely nuts. To pull back from Asia, again, you may want the Japanese and the South Koreans to pull their load. Of course, they do. Yet, I thought we're in this global competition with the Chinese. Are they going to trade Taiwan for some sort of deal with the Chinese? This is going to really disrupt the global order. And I think it speaks to this sort of 19th century worldview that Trump has, where his sphere of influence is in the Americas, and the Chinese and the Russians should have their sphere of influence. It's asking for trouble is what it is, and there's no surprise to me that the senior military leadership, looking at this and looking at the kind of global responsibilities and the pitfalls of doing this, are opposed, because it'll be their job to clean up the mess long after Donald Trump and J.D. Vance are gone.
And although Democrats are fully prepared to exercise oversight, the missing chunk in this, of course, is the Republicans who have oversight, who have the funding obligation in the Senate and the House. By the way, we're on the eve of the shutdown. And without their willingness to really take this apart, to exercise scrutiny, to flesh these details out. It's very hard for the minority party to say, wait, we shouldn't be doing these crazy things. So it sure would be nice if all those internationalists, those hawks, those former Cold Warriors would step up to the plate. That seems to be really missing here.
It is definitely missing, and it's been missing for a while. And I think that, it's clear that, the Republican Party is now the party of make America great and America first. And so even if there are members of Congress and in the Republican Party who are opposed to this, they are likely either not to speak out about it or speak out about it and then get, be criticized by the White House and then take back what they said. We've seen them do that over and over and over again. Now, I think possibly the good news here is that it takes a lot to move the ship of state, as they say. I mean, we're a big country, lots of obligations, lots of things, and it's hard to unwind a lot of these commitments. But look, Trump, if he puts his mind to it, can certainly make changes that will make Europe more vulnerable to Russia. And Europe is a core global interest. We want Europe to be democratic, prosperous, free, and a Russia that is aggressive towards Europe with right-wing populist parties that are pro-Russia. This is not good for the United States. Their freedom and prosperity bears on our freedom and prosperity, and vice versa. This is a market of 500 million people. We're totally intertwined with Europe. That's just one example of how ill thought out, ill advised this idea really is.
I would add to that what happens in Europe doesn't stay in Europe, that other countries take their cues, that China will say, oh, I guess we can't take Taiwan, whether we intend that to be the message or not. Now, I would be remiss, contrarians, if I didn't talk to you a bit about the events today, which was this bizarro meeting. The President of the United States, or actually the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense did this, and then I think Trump kind of inserted himself, called all of the top brass from all over the world, pulling them out of whatever they were doing, planning, training at huge expense to come to Washington. And he delivered what can only be described as a cringeworthy, bloviating, kind of rah-rah, kind of, Fox News episode. And to their credit, as he's going on and insulting fat generals and making himself look very small and very stupid, the generals and the other military sat there stone-faced. Then on comes the President of the United States and says a whole lot of batshit crazy stuff, including the fact that he is going to use our American cities as a training ground for the military. And he goes on about President Biden. He goes on in his usual pep talk. But it was interesting. Our generals, our admirals, are extremely disciplined. These are people who've been in the military 20, 30 years. They have been marinated in the Constitution, in their obligations, in the separation between the military and politics, and they sat there stone-faced and silent. Trump begged for applause. It was kind of like that cringeworthy moment when, the other Bush, Jeb Bush, said, "You can applaud now," and they wouldn't. That on a couple levels strikes me as, number one, they must be thinking, oh my God, this guy really is nuts. And we had better figure out how to hold the line. And the other thing is, I think we as Americans should be proud of our military. They get it. And those people who thought, oh, they're going to sign a loyalty oath, they're going to stand up and cheer, were really underestimating the strength of these people. And although I know, because we discussed it, you haven't had a chance to fully enjoy this entire diatribe, so I won't ask you about the specifics. I do want to ask you about the basic point about the military. We touched on this a little bit, about the military's obligation to the Constitution and to the national security of the United States. Do you have the same level of confidence? Perhaps I now have, having watched how they have conducted themselves and how they are behaving through this insane period of time.
Yes and no. It was, the way you describe it in the short clips that I've seen, it was admirable, absolutely admirable, and you'd expect nothing less from the senior military commander of the United States. As you point out, they have been inculcated with the ideas of the Constitution, and that they serve the Constitution, not a person. And I think that was one of the things that Mark Milley, those photos of him during the 2020 protests, he quite rightly said, I should not have been there. But it was the photos, the symbolism of those photos, that he was caught in that moment when he didn't intend it, and he pulled back and said, I should never have been there, and actually apologized, was also a sign of how admirable all of these people are. Here's what concerns me, however. Trump, begging for the adulation from the officers, is going to now say, these people aren't loyal to me, and now start tinkering with the officer corps in order to find people who will be loyal to him. And while they were stone-faced and silent, I do not underestimate Donald Trump's willingness to mess with, undermine, bend, break American institutions to his will. And he may take this away. He was deeply embarrassed. A narcissist like President Trump can't be deeply embarrassed by this. So I'm bracing for what his next move is, and I'm certain there will be one. So kudos to every single one of these officers who are brought around the world to great expense to listen to this. But at the same time, I fear what the reaction is going to be.
I think that's very wise counsel. Well, we are in for troubling times, and I think it behooves perhaps people who are former military to begin to speak out. It would be nice if secretaries of defense and state of both parties spoke out. It would be nice if presidents of both
Took the words
parties
right out of my
spoke
mouth.
out. Should we send out a pack of bloodhounds to find George W. Bush? It sure would be nice to hear from a Republican former president, but I wouldn't hold your breath. At any rate, fascinating discussion, Steve. As always, thank you so much.
Thanks for
Needless to
having
say,
me.
we're going to follow all of this, and we will have you back soon. So thanks very much.
Thank you. Cheers.